Today's stuff we're going to be learning is Chullin daf lamed hey. The good news is we are going to finish the sugya of Tumah and Tahara today. Maybe there were those of you who love this stuff. Either which way, we're going to finish it. I'm going to just go back and review a little bit because I know this material is very complicated and I want to make sure it's clear and also to kind of lead up to where we are and give structure to the whole sugya. We started with the Mishna on daf lamed gimel lamed aleph, where we said, "Ashochet behema chayav ha'of v'lo yatsa mehem dam." You slaughter the animal, no blood comes out. They're kshirim, and you can even eat them. That's the important part. With yadayim esavo, which means usually we mean your hands are shniot l'tuma. You can eat them, which means that and why? Because the meat never became susceptible to impurity. But it means that if blood did get on it, it would become susceptible to impurity. And if that's the case, it becomes susceptible to impurity, then you couldn't eat it with hands that were shniot. To which the Gemara said, I don't understand. It's all chulin we're talking about. Proved in 4 ways. How do we know it's chulin? Then said, if it's chulin, who cares? There's no shelishi, right? Your hands are shniot. They would make something into a shelishi. There's no shelishi when it comes to chulin. So I'm not going to go over the first 2 answers, but the third answer, right? We also had issues with the first 2 answers. The third answer is that we're talking about a scenario. The Mishna is discussing a scenario where you decided to treat your chulin like it was kodesh. And that's why we're talking about a problem of touching it with your hands if they're shenis, because you decided you're going to treat it like a shelishi, okay, like kodesh, which means you're going to go even to revi'i. Okay. Then we said, but this can't match the approach of Rabbi Yehoshua, because what did Rabbi Yehoshua say? And this is the key that got us off on these big tangents, which is, Rabbi Yehoshua says, okay, if you eat, right, this whole Mishna in Taharot was talking about eating. If you eat a rishon or a sheni, you become a sheni. If you eat a shelishi, you become a sheni for kodesh. Okay, that's what he said. Then we said, right, and then he said, but by the way, I'm only talking about eating this shelishi. What kind of shelishi am I talking about? Bitruma. And then the Gemara assumed that he meant specifically if you eat it al Taharot truma, it's going to be a problem that your shelishi is going to be a sheni for kodesh, but not for truma shachlu al Taharot kodesh, which means that what he was basically saying, according to this interpretation, and then we had 2 different ways of understanding him, that maybe he meant both, okay? But if he meant really only truma, what he was trying to say is, and this is a line we're going to come back to today as well, which is when you treat something as if it's truma, then we assume that you're not watching it enough to be able to eat kodashim. Okay, why do people treat even chulin like truma or kodashim? Because they wanted to just keep a very high level of protection from impurity in their house, in case they needed to eat truma and they don't want to mess up their truma, or in case they need to eat kodashim and don't want to mess up their kodashim. So now we're going to say the following. The theory here is that the rabbis, now the question is really, is there really shelishi status to this item? Because chulin really doesn't ever become a shelishi. So what Rabbi Yehoshua is saying is, if you treat it like truma, the rabbis said, okay, we're going to have shelishi here. Okay, but not for truma purposes only, that it will affect kodashim. Why? Very logically. Because it will, and now again, how will it affect it? Because you're going to jump up a level to sheni, and then you're going to ruin your kodashim, because kodashim go 3rd degree and 4th degree. Shelishi, revi'i. Now, why would the rabbis do this? Because what we answered yesterday is, so first of all, we gave a reason. Why would you specifically do it al Taharot truma and not al Taharot kodesh? We said that there were a lot more people that were treating their chulin like Taharot truma. So because people treated it that way, the rabbis said, okay, we'll take this seriously. Because there were very few people who did it for kodesh, they didn't take the kodesh so seriously. Okay, and that's the reason to distinguish. And then we saw yesterday that there were some who understood Rabbi Yehoshua in that way, that he was really only talking about Taharot truma, and then our Mishna wouldn't fit like him, because the only way to explain the Mishna is to say, it's chulin shenasu al Taharot kodesh, and he doesn't think that there's any effectiveness to saying that there's no shelishi there. If I say I'm going to treat my chulin like kodesh, and then something that was a sheni touches it, since it's chulin, we treat it like chulin, and the rabbis weren't strict there. They were only strict for that group of people. That's a much bigger group of people that treated their stuff al Taharot truma. That's one approach. The other approach is to say, no, he actually meant it in both. Okay? And when he said truma, he meant, obviously, if I treat it like kodesh, which is more stringent, because there's more stringent laws for kodesh, and even if I treated it like teruma. So those were the two approaches that we saw. We then ended the daf with Ulla, who basically came and said, even though we learned back in the beginning that ha'ochel shelishi shel Chullin, which was nasal Taharot teruma, it's going to be a sheni only for kodesh, which means if that sheni touches teruma, that person who's now a sheni, right? In other words, again, I'm going to just remind you, what was the whole reason for this whole prohibition? We're worried that in my mouth, I'm going to eat teruma at the same time I'm eating this tamei food, and that's why I'm going to become tamei, and that will keep me away from eating all the, right, from rooting teruma. I won't touch teruma because now I'm impure, right? I didn't point this out. I thought it was obvious, but maybe I should point it out, which is, if I become tamei from eating a shelishi, and I'm now a sheni for kodesh, so I can actually come in contact with teruma if I want, but I can touch it. But I need to go to the mikvah in order to touch kodashim, right? I need to go to the mikvah because I need to get out of this status, otherwise I could ruin kodashim. And now Ulla says I also can't eat teruma. So I'm going to have to also go to the mikvah to enable me to eat teruma. So Ulla's chumrah is that even though Rabbi Yehoshua said, shelishi is, if I eat shelishi, I'm a sheni lekodesh and not a sheni for teruma. He said, but even though I'm not a sheni for teruma, I can't actually eat teruma. I'm disqualified because I just ate something tamei, and I can't eat teruma. Okay, even though it was a shelishi. Remember, what's the whole reason? I really theoretically could eat teruma because if we're worried about the teruma mixing up in my mouth with the shelishi, a shelishi doesn't do anything to teruma. That's why really the shelishi is not a problem for teruma. But he says, since I ate something impure, we're going to basically say I have to go to the mikveh if I want to eat teruma. So that's his chiddush. Okay, and then we discussed that, brought a question, resolved it. Now we're going to start with Rabbi Yonatan, who says something very similar to Ulla, and we're going to have to figure out it's obvious what the difference is, but the question is, why do both need to be said? Amar Rabbi Yonatan, Amar Rebbe. Ha'ochel shelishi shel teruma atzma. Okay, basically just to point out, until we finish this teruma and Tara sugya, we have two main points. One is this Rabbi Yonatan statement, and then we're going to say, what is he adding to Ulla, and why couldn't we have just had either Ulla or Rabbi Yonatan? And then we're going to go into a statement of Rabbi Yitzchak bar Shmuel bar Marta, and we're going to have some difficulties on his statement. And that's going to be the end of the sugya. Okay, so what does Rabbi Yonatan say? Amar Rabbi Yonatan, Amar Rebbe. Ha'ochel shelishi shel teruma atzma. Okay, now here we're talking about something different. Not ha'ochel teruma of Chullin shenasu al Taharot kodesh, but you ate a shelishi that was actually teruma. Now we talked about before, we didn't want to say that was the Mishna, because then you're not allowed to eat teruma that's a shelishi. Teruma that's a shelishi has to be burned. It's ruined teruma, and it must be burned, because teruma is sanctified. You disqualify something sanctified, you have to burn it. And that's why they didn't want to say our case was the case where it was a shelishi of teruma that you actually was eating in a prohibited manner. But here we're going to say, what if you did anyway? Let's say you had your teruma, you're a kohen, you had your teruma, it became a shelishi, became disqualified, you didn't burn it, instead you ate it. So, asur le'echol umutar liga. Now he says exactly like Ulla said about the shelishi of the Chullin, the fake teruma, you could call it, right? The fake shelishi, which was only because I treated it like teruma, so it became a shelishi, but it was really Chullin. Now he's saying the exact same thing about the real thing. If I really ate a shelishi, and as I ate a real shelishi, same thing. I can't eat teruma now, but I can touch teruma. Okay? Now, it's derived to Ulla, but it's derived to Rabbi Yonatan. Now, why do you need them both? They're really both saying the same thing. Fake teruma, real teruma, but what's the difference, right? Real shelishi, fake shelishi. Okay, either which way, right? It's kind of the same, it's the same law. Why do we need them both? Okay, now this is just obvious logic. De'imi de Ulla, if you just had Ulla, what would you have thought? Havamina, hanimila b'chulin shenasu al Taharot teruma. Obviously, chulin shenasu al Taharot teruma you would think are more lenient than actual shelishi of teruma. So you might have thought about teruma b'negia nami aser. Maybe if I ate a shelishi of teruma, maybe I wouldn't be allowed to touch teruma. Okay? And comes Rabbi Yonatan and says, no, I can actually touch teruma. I'm not that tamei, because you have to remember, shelishi is the end game of teruma. So if I eat the end game of teruma, I can't pass on impurity to another level of impurity. But they did forbid me from eating teruma, because I just ate forbidden, right, teruma that was a shelishi, and I'm tamei from eating teruma now. Okay, that's so we wouldn't have necessarily learned it from Chullin, because we might have thought Chullin shenasu al Taharot teruma will be less strict about it. This should be more strict, and we should say even when I touch will be, I'll ruin. Can't touch truma. And so therefore it's drift to Rabbi Yonatan. That's why he needed to come in and say, no, it's the exact same law. And now for that same logic, we're going to say, what if we just have Rabbi Yonatan, who said, for truma atzma, for actual truma, can't eat, can touch. What would I thought if you didn't have Ulla? I would have thought we'd be more lenient. What would be more lenient? Hava mina, hanemili truma. Maybe you would thought it's only if I eat a shelishi of actual truma. Ava chulin, but if I ate chulin that was treated like truma, ba'achila nami shari. Even, maybe I'll even be allowed to eat truma. Sriche. And that's why you need both of them. Okay, so in the end, we explain why each one is a chumrah, and therefore, we need to know, because truma is more chamor than chulin shenasu al Taharot kodesh, but in the end, they have the same law, at least according to Rabbi Yonatan and Ulla. Think each one said it. We can assume these two work together, and we're going to say the same thing for each. Okay, now Yativ Rav Yitzchak bar Shmuel bar Marta kamed Rav Nachman. Okay, so Rav Yitzchak bar Shmuel bar Marta comes before Rav Nachman and he says the following statement. V'yativ v'ka'amar. And this is what I said is going to take us till the end of the sugya for this section. Okay, then we're going to go back to our Mishna and Rabbi Shimon's position. Ha'ochel shelishi shel chulin shenasu al Taharot kodesh. Okay, now we're back to the shelishi of chulin that was treated like kodesh. This is the one we had a debate. Does Rabbi Yehoshua think that it's a sheni for kodesh or not? Okay, we're going to have another debate here. Tahor le'echol b'kodesh. He says, if you treat your chulin, like it's kodesh, and you have a shelishi, and you ate it, you can eat kodesh. Okay, there's no problem to eat kodashim. Why? She'en lecha davar she'oseh revi'i b'kodesh ela kodesh mekudash bilvad. He says the whole idea of revi'i is all like an added thing. The fact that there's 4th degree impurity for kodashim, and the only way to pass on 4th degree of impurity to kodashim is by kodesh mekudash. What is kodesh mekudash? Okay, let's go back to zvachim and all sorts of things we learned about sanctifying animals. Okay, the obvious, I'll just mention a few things that are kodashim. We have meal offerings. Okay, let's just the obvious: meal offerings, wine libations, and animals. Okay, those are the main things. So an animal, I can designate it, When I designate an animal for a sacrifice, it's already sanctified. But that's not kodesh mekudash. That's not enough. Why? That's not enough to say, if that item gets impure, it will pass on impurity, okay? In an animal, it'll be a little different because a live animal isn't anyway impure. But let's say a meal offering. I designate a meal offering, and I have the soled and the shemen, but I don't yet put it in a sanctified vessel. I just said I'm using this soled for the mincha, so it has sanctity, but not enough sanctity that if it were to become impure by a shelishi, it could pass on impurity to a revi'i or something like that. No. Why not? Because all those were just in name only. Kodesh mekudash means you need to actually do an action to sanctify it. So by an animal, it would be slaughtering it. By a meal offering, it would be putting it in the sanctified vessel. If you remember, we had like the shtei alechem, or sanctified when you slaughter the seirim that go along with it, right? There's some action that has to go along with it. Until that action is done, there's no passing it along. Which obviously means then, there's no revi'i in chulin shenasu al Taharot kodesh. Because chulin shenasu al Taharot kodesh, how did they become 3rd level, 4th level, right? It's all by just saying, I'm going to treat my chulin like kodesh. I certainly didn't do anything to sanctify this item that now became impure. So he basically doesn't think that he says, if I eat a shelishi of chulin that was treated like kodesh, I certainly can't turn, if what Rabbi Yehoshua said, it becomes a sheni for kodesh. He doesn't agree with that. Now remember, this matches the opinion that Rabbi Yehoshua only said it in a teruma case, not if I treat my chulin like kodesh. Okay, so it matches that opinion. That when it comes to kodesh, it's just not going to work. There's no revi'i b'kodesh if I designate it in words. But the problem is this doesn't really match Rabbi Yehoshua, because if I can't pass on sheni l'kodesh, I can't pass on impurity to kodashim by just designating in words that it's going to be treated like kodesh, then you would say kosher kein truma. All the more so if I treated it like truma, right? And what does he basically say? In order to pass on impurity to kodesh, it has to be I did an action. So it shouldn't work, like Rabbi Yehoshua said either, by treating it like it's teruma, because that's just also designating it in words. And what does Rabbi Yehoshua say? We're going to see this in a minute. Maybe I'll just read it, okay, because we're already up here. Marta, Rami bar Hama. Shelishi, if I eat a shelishi, what does Rabbi Yehoshua say? We're back to that Mishna. Sheni lekodesh ve'ein sheni leteruma. It becomes a sheni to pass on to kodashim, which could make it a shelishi, which could make the next one, it touches a revi'i, right? The shelishi touches something, it's a revi'i. And what did he say? It's bechulin shanasu al Taharot teruma. So if Rav Yitzchak says that if I have my chulin shanasu al Taharot kodesh, it can't pass on impurity because the only way to do it is by kodesh mekudash, is by actually doing an action to turn something into actual kedusha. Then kol shekain, okay, Rashi says it like this. If you look at the end of Rashi, born with kodesh mekudash, v'kasal kadatach. At this point, when Rami bar Hama asks this question, he assumes the kol shekain chulin shanasu al Taharot teruma. Right? If you need to do an action, saying that I'm treating it like kodesh would then be a kol shekain, and all the more so if I just say I'm treating it like teruma. Of course, it's not going to pass on impurity to kodesh. So how could Rabbi Yehoshua make that? If Rabbi Yitzchak bar Shmuel is right, he's completely contradicted by what Rabbi Yehoshua says, because Rabbi Yehoshua clearly doesn't think. He thinks by designating it by words only, I'm treating this like teruma. You can create third degree, right? You become a second degree impurity, right? Which passes it on to kodesh. So that seems to completely contradict Rav Yitzchak. To which, right, so that's what they say, Amai, Hai Lav Kodesh Mekudashu. That is not Kodesh Mekudash, right? Chulin Shanasu al Taharot Teruma. So Amrale, now we go back to an answer of something we said yesterday, which is Hanach L'Truma Shetaharata Tum'ahi Etzel HaKodesh. What does he say? You misunderstood what's going on here. The problem here is that when you treated your Chulin al Taharot Teruma, in Rabbi Yehoshua's case, the reason why you're going to pass on impurity to kodashim is not because the rabbi said we're going to give validity to the fact that this is a shelishi. No, it's actually a rishon. Why is it a rishon? Right? It's a rishon, and then remember, what does Rabbi Yehoshua say? If you eat a rishon, what are you? You're a sheni, okay? For kodesh only. Why for kodesh only and not for teruma? Because we said that people who watch things for teruma are not trusted for kodashim. If you want to eat kodashim, you need to keep a higher standard of impurity. So basically, if you didn't keep that highest standard, you kept a high standard, but not the highest standard. You treated all your chulin as if they're trumas. You were very careful from impurity. But we don't trust that level of impurity when it comes to kodesh. When it comes to kodesh, we expect the highest level of impurity. That means if something touches your kodashim, an item of food, we're going to just assume that it's very likely it's a rishon, which means that you now ate that. So the shelishi, right, that became a shelishi, you know it came in contact with something that was a sheni, but you don't know it came in contact with an avatuma, but we're going to assume that something could have gone wrong somewhere along the road, and it's completely high-level impurity. And that's why, when you eat this shelishi, you become a sheni for kodesh, okay, which explains to us why you're a sheni for kodesh and not for teruma. But that explains it very well. Okay, so that's why, right, and now we're going to say the following. That's why, remember, this goes now with that Rabbi Yehoshua said his words only, bechulin shanasu al Taharot teruma. Because in the end, right, besides we said there's going to be effectiveness to the fact that you make the shelishi, but it's actually more than that now we say, right? It's because we assume that your item probably got impure, and when it comes to kodashim, we're going to have a super high level of purity. We're going to assume maybe one day you turned around, didn't notice something, and it happened, and you just have no idea. And we're going to be strict. Okay? So now, that resolves the problem against Rav Yitzchak. Before we go to the second question, we're going to have a few issues here, though. The first is not an issue. The first is just minatemra. Where do we get this idea from? That we just said, which we also talked about yesterday, that its tahara is tuma etzel kodesh. Okay? That what keeps you good for teruma is not good enough for kodashim. And here's a very simple Mishna, or I don't know, simple, but it's a Mishna Chagiga, which basically gives you the hierarchy for things. Which means like what? Okay, there's a hierarchy of people in the world as they relate to teruma and tahara. Okay, we start with Amei Haaretz. Amei Haaretz, we've seen in many sugyot. They're suspect of all sorts of things. One of the things is they don't keep Tum and Tara very well. So big day Ama'aretz, midras lepushim. Okay, I mentioned this Tumat midras yesterday. Tumat midras is if a zav, zava, yoledet, or nida sits on, let's say, a bench, and there was a cover on the bench. That cover, that cloth, let's say, that was covering it, is something they sit on, and they did sit on it. It becomes an avatuma and is impure. Now, if you get any random cloth that could theoretically have been used for midras, you have no idea, okay, from an Ama'aretz, since they're not careful about Tum and Tara, you have to assume, now remember, every house mostly has women in it, women who are menstruating, Nida problems. So you get, how common is it that a woman who's in Nida sits on a bench, right? Not to mention, it could be Zavas, there could be Zavs, there could be Yoledet, women who gave in childbirth. All these things could be. So therefore, you get a beged from them, you have to assume that it has Tumat Midras if you're a Prushi. What's a Prushi? Those are the regular rabbis and, the people who cared about halacha were careful about things. So for the Prushim, you're going to get a beged from an Amaretz, you have to treat it as if it's impure. Big day Prushim. Now, if you're midras la'ochle truma, you're an ochel truma, you live in a family of kohanim and you eat truma, and you keep a higher level of sanctity than the Prushim, because you have to, because you eat truma all the time. So you're much more careful about these things. So if you get a beged from level 2, right, we're going up, okay? Level 1, the lowest is the Ama'aretz. Then we get to the Prushim. You get a beged from a Prushi. If you're in level 3 of the Ochle Truma, you can't use their beged. It's Trumat Midras. And finally, and this is what we're looking for, Big Day Ochle Truma, Midras LeKodesh. If you get a beged from Ochle Truma, and you're someone who's going to eat Kodesh, you can't trust that beged of the Ochle Truma. So here you see it, that there's a higher standard for Kodesh. And that seems very clear. Except that Rava comes along. So that was just the source for the distinction that we made to resolve the contradiction between our Mishna and Rav Yitzchak. To which, because again, Rabbi Yehoshua was talking about al Taharot Truma, and Rabbi Yitzchak was talking about al Taharot Kodesh, and they're not the same thing. Rava says, Midrasot Kamart, you're trying to prove our case about this meat or produce or an item that was touched by, right, the shelishi, you ate the shelishi, that's not midras, right? That's produce. That's a different, right? We're not talking about cloths, garments, okay? Midrasot, come out, you're trying to prove from that Mishna Chagiga, a midras? Shani midrasot, turning out amubet, shema tesheva lehenish tonida. The reason why, exactly what I said, because there you're worried about the wife who's in need of sitting on something. That's a very big fear, okay? Because it's super, super common. Aval beperi lo amrina, but who's to say that if you watch your produce from becoming impure for truma, that's not going to be enough for kodashim? Who's to say that? He says just because there's a Mishna and Midras doesn't mean there's a Mishna that this is relevant to produce itself. So that's a difficulty back on Rav Yitzchak, right? In other words, the resolution, it's really a problem with the resolution that we just gave. But Rav Yitzchak beperinami amrina, we just have to say that Rav Yitzchak must have held that we hold the same thing for produce as well. Okay? And then we resolve that. But also, once we make this distinction that people who are careful for truma are not careful for kodesh, we're going to have a problem with the following source. So it's another difficulty on this resolution of the original difficulty. Because in the end, there's going to be two main difficulties against Rabbi Yitzchak. We're still within the first one. Mativ Rabbi Yirmiyah Difti. Umiyamrina beperi. So now he says also, I don't think we say the same concept in produce and Hama. Now here he's not bringing logic. He's bringing a braita. Okay, it says v'hatnan. This is a Mishna in Chagiga. Umiyamrina beperi v'hatnan. Doesn't it say in another Mishna in Chagiga? Before we're on Daf Yuchet, now we're on Daf Kafdalin in Chagiga. Im amar hifrashti letocha revi'i kodesh. Ne'eman. Okay, let's just talk about the case. There's different explanations what this case is, but we'll go with a basic explanation. You have a barrel of wine. It's a barrel of truma wine. And you say, I'm going to bring a wine libation from a revi'i, a quarter log of this wine. So you basically say, without separating it, you leave it in the barrel and you say, this is like breira, if you remember, right? You have a barrel of wine and you say, some of this wine is going to be kodesh, and you're going to take out a quarter log later. Okay, so now you have this mixture of kodesh and truma. Now, if we say that you're not keeping the same standard for truma as you are for kodesh, Velo kamitame le truma le kodesh. You end up with this mixture of truma and kodesh. And the assumption is, right, you're ne'eman, you believe that you said, I did this, right? So meaning, now this quarter load can be brought for your libations. How can you bring a quarter load of libations when it's mixed with truma? If you're not careful with truma, as you're careful enough for truma purposes, but not for kodesh, you now have kodesh mixed in with this truma. And if you're not going to watch your truma properly, then how are we going to allow this kodesh? So they say, V'i amar tarata truma hi etzel kodesh. Now, if you say that what's tahor for truma doesn't work for kodesh, titame truma l'kodesh. The truma in this barrel that's now touching the kodashim, which we don't even know which kodashim is which, it's all mixed up. The truma is touching kodesh. Imagine, right, we just view, okay, the little top part is kodesh, the bottom part is truma. Whenever I take out my kodesh, it came in contact with the truma. And we weren't careful about the truma, so how could we say that the kodesh is good to go? To which they answer, Amar le, truma b'chiburin ka Marta. What you're asking about a case of truma and kodashim that are mixed up together. When we said you're not going to watch your truma, that's when you have a truma, and then later, right, it touches kodesh. It's going to mess it up because we're going to assume the truma is, even though for truma purposes it was completely pure, we're going to assume for kodesh it's bad, and now it touches your piece of kodesh. But, right, if you're going to say that, truma, this is truma, it's all mixed up, the truma and the kodesh. Truma b'chibur and shanu, that's obviously different. Demigo de mehem and a kodesh, mehem and nami a truma. At this point, you're going to protect that barrel as best as you can. You're not going to say, oh, well, there's some truma in that barrel, I just won't watch it carefully. No, you're going to say there's kodesh in that barrel, and therefore I have to keep a very high standard. So that's why, obviously, in this case, this is not a contradiction at all to our theory that someone who's believed for truma is not going to be trusted for kodashim, and that explains the whole thing, that even though, again, I'm just going to go back and finalize, like go back to the beginning, even though Rav Yitzchak says if you eat a shelishi of Chullin that were treated like Taharot kodesh, you can't make a revi'i, but if you treated it like Taharot truma, you can pass on to a shelishi and then a revi'i, right, if you ate this, because we assume it's actually a rishon, okay? We assume that it's completely impure as relates to kodashim. But this case of the mixture is irrelevant, because once there's kodesh in there, we assume you're keeping it to the highest standard because you don't want to mess up your kodesh. So you can't say, oh, it touched the truma and the truma. Doesn't make any sense. Okay, now we're going to move to the second difficulty, and with that we're going to finish our sugya. Matav Rav Huna bar Natan, second difficulty against Rav Yitzchak. Hasheni shebachulin. Okay, this is just talking about basic laws of chulin, of tuma, which we had a few like this before, right? If it's this, it's going to do that. Okay, so if you have a sheni of chulin, which theoretically shouldn't pass on anything in chulin, well, it's mitame mashke chulin. Okay, it does two things. One is, I mentioned this tumat mashkin yesterday with the sheni to the sheni, and if there's liquid on it, because anything that's a sheni that touches liquid, the rabbis made a decree that it ups the liquid to a rishon. Okay, because a liquid conducts and it moves things around. They treated liquids, there's a whole reason for liquids, I'm not going to get into it, but they gave this chumrah by liquids, that liquids become a rishon. Okay, so if you have a sheni of chulin, it could actually mess up a liquid to be a rishon, which then could touch some other item and turn it into a sheni. And posel ochle truma. What else can a sheni shebachulin do? If it touches a piece of food that's a truma, it ruins it, because again, it turns it into a shelishi. If it touches chulin, it's not going to do anything, but if it touches truma, it's going to ruin it. Okay, or if it touches a liquid that's chulin, it could make it a rishon. V'ashlishi mitame mashke kodesh. Now a shelishi, that's, let's say, right, shelishi can also create impurity in a liquid, same as a sheni, and posel ochle truma. And it can disqualify, posel ochle kodesh. A shelishi can pass on impurity to kodesh. Now, what kind of shelishi are we talking about here? So the Breita tells us, okay, I want to point out, this is just a side point. In the Masoret HaShas, it says it's a Mishna in Taharot, Mishna Vav, Perek Vav, Mishna Vav, but the commentaries point out that it even says Ayin Sham, look there, because it's not exactly word for word the same. So most people think this is just a Breita, and it's not actually a Mishnah. Okay, there is a Mishnah that's similar, but not really. Okay, anyway, that's, if anybody wants to look at the Mishnah there and see how it's different. Okay, but in any case, what do we have here? Here's our key line. When does the shelishi posel kodesh? In a case, okay, let's just, before we go on, When would you say it according to Rav Yitzchak? Only in Chullin shenasu al Taharot truma, or only if it's really, right, that we're assuming we're talking about a shelishi that's not supposed to be burned, that's not a real teruma shelishi or a real kodashim shelishi. But according to Rav Yitzchak, it would be either a real teruma, a real kodesh, that could all pass on impurity, right? A kodesh mekudash, let's say it was already in a kli sharet, or it was already slaughtered, or all those things. And if it's chulin that was treated like what? Fill in the blank, according to Rav Yitzchak, only if it's al Taharot truma. Not if it's al Taharot kodesh. He said, if you treat your chulin like it's al Taharot kodesh, it's so far from kodesh mekudash, right? And it doesn't have that chumrah of truma, well, you treated your truma not as well for kodashim, so we're going to make you disqualify kodashim. No. So he thinks it would only be chulin shenasu al Taharot truma. But what does the Braita here say? Bechulin shenasu al Taharot kodesh. So that completely contradicts Rav Yitzchak, and there's no way to say it otherwise. This basically says, so forget the whole rest of this Mishna, our Braita, but the basic point of this Braita that we brought it for is, let's just go from the backwards, right, from the end backwards. Chulin shenasu al Taharot kodesh could create a revi'i, okay? Create a shelishi, could create a revi'i in kodesh, can ruin kodashim, okay? And he said, no way, no how. Only things that are really sanctified, not that you just called them kodesh. Okay. So the obvious answer, because when you have a Tanaitic source that completely contradicts and there's no real way to read it otherwise, is to say Tanaihi. Well, it's a machloket Tanaim, meaning this Braita stands with one position, and Rav Yitzchak, who's in Amora, follows a different position of Tanaim. So we're now going to say this is a Tanaitic debate. So the statement of Rav Yitzchak is basically a Tanaitic debate. Some people agree with, if there are some Tanaim that say what he says, and there's other Tanaim that don't. So this Braita, which clearly contradicts, is a different opinion. Now we have to prove. You can't just say Tanai without proving which Tana holds like him. And with this, we'll end this section. Ditanya, as it says in a Braita, Chulin shenasu al Taharot kodesh, harehin kechulin. Okay, according to the first opinion here, there's actually two opinions. They both fit in with Rav Yitzchak. He basically says Chulin shenasu al Taharot kodesh is like chulin. Okay, if you treat them al Taharot kodesh, okay, there's no problem, right? And that's what he said. Ha'ochel shelishi shel chulin shenasu al Taharot kodesh tahur le'echol b'kodesh. Right, you can eat kodesh because there's no problem. Also here, there's no problem. They're chulin. We don't treat this as anything. Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Tzadok omer harein ketruma l'tamishnayim u'lifsol echad. Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Shimon also, you could say that Rabbi Yitzchak goes with him. Okay, we don't know which one he holds by, but neither of them contradict him. Because what does he say? They're like truma in the sense that they can l'tameh shnayim, right? They can make a sheni and lifsol echad. Okay, so they can go 2 degrees, right? They can do l'tameh shnayim. A rishon can make a sheni and then a shelishi, and it disqualifies a shelishi because remember that's the end game in truma. Doesn't, if you say litameh, it means it can become tameh and pass on impurity. But it only does it to truma. In other words, it's not a problem for kodesh. It doesn't pass on impurity in kodashim. So that perfectly matches chulin shenasu al Taharot kodesh doesn't pass on impurity for kodashim. Okay, that's only kodesh mekudash bilvad, as Rav Yitzchak said, or at least we can assume that, and that fits. So what we did in the second section, if we'll just summarize now at the end of our daf, we'll just summarize the last section, we'll summarize because now we really finished this whole section. We did Rabbi Yonatan and Ulla, who both said eating a shelishi of teruma or eating a shelishi of chulin shenasu al Taharot teruma, you won't be able to eat teruma anymore. Okay, but you can touch, right? You're impure to eat teruma, but you can touch teruma. You won't pass on impurity by touch. So we had those 2 statements, one from yesterday, one from today, and then we did what's the uniqueness of each one? Why did they both need to tell you this? Okay, what might you have thought if you hadn't heard both statements, if you only have one? Then we got to Rav Yitzchak bar Shmuel bar Marta, who basically says in front of Rav Nachman that if you eat a shelishi of chulin that was done on Taharot kodesh, it's not going to pass on any. You can eat kodashim, you can touch kodashim, nothing's going to happen. And then we brought 2 difficulties against him. One was Rabbi Yehoshua, okay, and who we assumed, well, since he said al Taharot truma, right, that koshkein Taharot truma wouldn't be effective at all because of kodashes, and of course that wouldn't be. But we rejected that comparison by distinguishing No, the whole problem is if you're careful for teruma, you're actually not careful for kodesh, and that's why Rabbi Yehoshua is strict when it comes to the world of kodashim. In the case of Taharot teruma, because you weren't careful enough for kodesh, and then we said, right, we learn it from Midrash. Rava said, I don't think you should learn it from Midrash. This isn't the same thing, but Rabbi Yitzchak thought it was. And, Rabbi Yirmiyami Tifti said also, I don't think you say it because of the wine issue. We said, no, the wine issue is mechubarim. That's different, right? They're combined. So obviously you're caring, you're taking care not to have it impure. And then we got to our second difficulty where we really said explicitly against Rabbi Yitzchak, and then we said, well, it's a machloket tanaim. For that, we brought a Tanaitic debate. Okay. And sugya, complicated sugya of Taharot. Now we're moving back to our topic. So Rabbi Shimon in the Mishna had said, Huchshiru b'shchita. He said, you don't need blood, which has got us off on that whole thing. You don't need blood to get on the animal, to make it susceptible to impurity. It's the shchita that does it. Okay, the shchita makes it susceptible to impurity because, remember, we talked about the vessel. A vessel, when it's formed, right? The animal is now kosher, right? Slaughtered properly. It's no longer Aver min achai. That changed it into live animal, to something you can eat that's kosher. That fixed it, so to speak. So all you need is shchita. Okay, very simple. Comes Rav Asi, and we're going to deal with this statement of Rav Asi. Is he right? Is he wrong? Can we prove him? Can we not disprove him? Well, Rav Asi makes a statement. Omer haya Rabbi Shimon, shchitato machsheret velo dam. Well, Rabbi Shimon said the shchita is machsheret. He didn't say anything about the blood. Rav Asi comes and says the blood wouldn't make it susceptible to impurity. Why not? Well, you need a liquid, right? And it has to be a liquid that's like water, because the pasuk about Chashar l'kabel teruma is talking about water. There's seven liquids, including water. Yad shachat dam is the rashi tevot for it. But without going into all of them right now, but the reason for all these seven is they're all similar to water in some way. So he comes and says, now, while blood is one of them, not blood from shchita. The blood from shchita is not considered like water. Now, what defines water? Number one, it's a drink. Okay? Number two, we're going to see that maybe there's other ways. We'll get to it at the end of the daf. But the point is, the blood of shchita is not, okay, now, no blood you would think is really like a drink, like water, but there has to be something about it that's like water, and shchita blood is not like water. Okay? We don't right know what's going to be similar, but he says it's not, and therefore, okay, well, what's the difference? You don't need the blood anyway, because you slaughter the animal. That already makes it. But let's say the blood of shchita fell on produce. Would it make it susceptible to impurity or not? That's really the relevance. So he doesn't discuss it really, Rabbi Shimon. So comes Rav Asi and says, well, no, he means only shchita, not dam, because he's disagreeing with Tanakama. So lema meseale, let's try to bring a proof from him from the language of the Mishnah. Rabbi Shimon omer huchsharu b'shchita. So my love is not the way to read this. Okay, today's going to be all of this. The end of the daf is all about how do you read this. Okay, can we read into this? Well, when he says b'shchita, does he not mean b'shchita below b'dam? In other words, he's relating to the rabbis who said the blood, and he's saying the shchita, not the blood, because the blood wouldn't work. So they say no. Lo af b'shchita. No, maybe he means even shchita, meaning I agree with you, the blood would work, but you don't need it because you have the shchita. So it doesn't really prove that blood can't do it, the blood of shchita. Okay, so that wasn't a good proof. Now we're going to bring three tashmas, which basically means we're going to bring a source from somewhere else and try to show. The first one's going to try to show it's not a drink, okay, like proving Rav Asi. The next two are going to try to go against Rav Asi, but either which way, in all these sources, we're going to end up saying it's not conclusive, how to read this source. Tashma, Amar Lahem Rabbi Shimon. So this is one of those expanded conversations that happened between Rabbi Shimon and the rabbis about our Mishnah. It didn't appear in our Mishnah, but appears in the Braita. Amar Lahem Rabbi Shimon, V'chi adam machshir, halo shchita machsheret. What, is it the blood that does the hachshara? No, it's the shchita that makes it susceptible. Okay, so what does it sound like? It's not the blood, because the blood can't. No, not necessarily. Hachi ka'amar lahen. V'chi dam bilvad machshir, av shchita nami machsheret. You could say that what he said is, you think the blood is the only thing that makes it susceptible? No, it's actually also the shchita could make it susceptible to impurity, which again means even if no blood came out, it would be susceptible to impurity by the shchita. So that doesn't prove that blood could never create susceptibility to impurity. Maybe it can. Okay, tashma. Now we're going to try to prove that blood really is machshir, okay, against Rav Asi. Tashma, Rabbi Shimon Omer. Now we're going to get into all other different kinds of bloods, okay? We're going to start with dam hamet. Dam hamet eno machshir. If you have blood from an animal, not that was slaughtered, but died on its own, okay? We're going to have died on its own, killed, and slaughtered. Okay, these are the three we're going to be discussing. So dam hamet eino machshir, blood from a dead animal that just died on its own, it does not create susceptibility to impurity. Now, what's the inference? That some other blood that's similar to it would. What would be the obvious inference? Well, if it dies on its own, it's not. But my lav ha dam shchita machshir, right? But then the blood from slaughter would, and that goes against Ravasi. No, ha dam chalalim machshir. No, the dam of a halal. What's a halal? An animal that was killed by someone, like shot by an arrow or something, right? Not slaughtered. So the fact that it says dam hamet, an animal that died on its own, is to exclude dam chalalim, which would be machshir. Now, why would dam chalalim be machshir over anything else? So we're going to see this at the end of the daf, but I'll already tell you because otherwise it doesn't make so much sense. There's a pasuk that says dam chalalim yishteh. Okay, dam chalalim yishteh. This is in the Bilam, in his poems that he did. All right, in am kalavi yakum. Okay, relevant to our recent war, am kalavi uchari naseh lo yishkav. What do you see here? There's someone who drinks dam chalalim, and it's called yishteh. It's a drink. Okay, there you have it. It says in the pasuk it's yishteh. That makes it like water. So when it says dam hamet, it's coming to exclude dam chalalim. Dam hamet is not machshir. Dam chalalim would be, has nothing to do with shchita, and therefore you can't infer anything from here. But then they say, wait, you want to then say aval dam shchita mai lo machshir. In other words, if you can't prove that it's right, maybe you'll say dam, right? You said dam hamet eino machshir, and that includes the dam of shchita because it's only coming to exclude dam chalalim. If it's on the side with dam hamet, then lishmi'ina dam shchita, v'kosh ken dam hamet. Then you should say dam shchita, and all the more so the dam of an animal that just dies on its own is not a mashkeh. To which they say no. Forget dam shchita. This has nothing to do with this. What they really wanted to compare in that source was dam hamet with dam chalalim. Why? It's drichale. How do you view the death of an animal that just dies on his own? The malach hamavet killed it. What's the death of someone that killed it? Someone killed it. So both cases is someone killed it. One was a person, one was the angel of death. But you could say theoretically, maybe if dam chalalim is a drink, then maybe the dam of an animal that died on its own is also a drink. Okay? But because maybe they're similar, because what's the difference whether it was killed by a person or killed by the angel of death? So therefore, we're going to assume that the sources specifically chose to tell you dam hamet to say no, it's not the same. Don't think they're the same. But again, nobody was thinking at the time about dam shchita. Dam shchita, isn't mentioned there. And then again, it's not clear, but if they're trying to say, you could at least say that dam shchita is just like dam hamet, and it's not machshir, which then would prove Ravasi. But again, it's inconclusive in the end, because you could read it both ways. Tashma, third source. Third and last one for today. Tashma. Rabbi Shimon Omer, dam magefato eno machshir. If you have blood from a wound of an animal, it's not machshir. My lav, hadam shchita machshir. This is going to be the exact same as what we did a minute ago, which is, dam magefa no, dam shchita yes. To which they say no. Hadam chalalim machshir. No, they're not comparing the dam of a wound to dam of the slaughter. They're comparing dam of a wound, blood of a wound, to blood of a killing. Okay? Someone killed the animal. So then you're going to say again, dam from a wound does not create susceptibility. Dam of chalalim is. Aval dam shchita mai lo machshir. So then you're going to say what? So dam shchita isn't included in that, right? It's going to be just like the dam magefa because it's not included in the inference. Lishmin and dam shchita v'koshkin dam magefato. So why don't you just say dam shchita no, and all the more so you would learn also not dam from a wound. So they say no. Again, just like the previous, it's the same format. Dam magefato it's drichale. We needed to compare specifically dam magefa and dam chalalim because you might have thought they were the same. Why would you have thought that? What's the difference if I kill the whole animal or I kill part of the animal? Because theoretically, cutting, right, breaking a bone in the animal, causing it to bleed, is kind of like a part of death. Okay, so you might have thought if the blood of chalalim creates susceptibility to impurity, maybe also the dam of a wound, and that's why they needed to tell you not. Okay, one last point they want to say now based on this. Mishna dam chalalim de machshir. Now, if we already established that dam chalalim is machshir, what's the reason? And now I already read this to you, but now we're going to read it inside. Dichtiv v'dam chalalim yishted, because it connects it to water by saying someone's drinking this dam chalalim. Dam shchita nami ktiv ala aretz tishbachenu kemayim. In Devarim chapter 12 it says, don't eat the blood, spill it on the ground like water. Wait a minute. That's slaughter blood they're talking about there, because they're talking about when you kill an animal to eat. And it says, spill it on the ground like water. What do you see from here? Blood is like water. If blood is like water, blood of shchita. So how could you try suggesting that Rav Asi says it's not, if it's so obvious to you that dam chalalim is like water because it says yishteh, all the more so, this should be like water because it says it's like water. So they say, no, that pasuk is not coming to teach you about susceptibility and purity. It's coming to teach you something else. Now, this comes up many times in Shas, that those psukim in Dvarim, you bet, okay, you can look inside at the psukim, but they're talking, and we don't have time right now, but they're talking about psulei hamukdashim, which is they're talking about meat that was supposed to be used in the temple, but got disqualified, like a blemished animal or something like that. And ahula mishrei daman de psulei mukdashim bahana'ah uda'ate. With that, when that pasuk says spill it on the ground like water, what they mean is you don't have to treat it with sanctity, even though the animal was originally a sanctified animal. Now that it's disqualified, you could just spill the water. There's no isur hana'ah. Now, why would you have thought there is? I'm just going to continue one more sentence. You might have thought ho'il va'asire begiza va'avodah. Now, when the animal's still alive and it's disqualified from being used in the temple, there's certain rules. You can't shear it. You can't benefit from it, basically. You can't shear it. You can't work it. You can't use it to work in your field. So you might have thought, maybe you would have thought the blood needs to be buried. That's what the pasuk al arz kamayim comes to tell you. You can just spill the blood on the ground. You don't have to worry about benefiting from the blood. You only have to worry about benefiting from the animal when it's still alive. Once you kill it, the blood is not forbidden to benefit from. And then that pasuk doesn't teach you about susceptibility to impurity. So we're left with that Rav Asi claims that Rav Shimon didn't think that blood is machshir l'kabel tumah, didn't think it's treated like water or like other blood that is, like the dam chalalim, for example. But in the end, it's really not so clear. Okay, we brought all these sources to try. In the end, no source really proved it. And theoretically, we could say we're left with Rav Asi, but it's not necessarily clear that that's what Rabbi Shimon means. And with that, we finish for today's daf. Wishing everyone a good day.